I knew about you because you ordered one of my pieces many years ago. I thought it was interesting because I think I just had written the piece. It's a piece from 2014, Command Fantasy. And then all of a sudden I got this order from you. And it's not like I get orders every day. Even now, it's like, every once in a while I get an order. So I was really wondering like what drew you to that in the first place.
Yeah, so there are a couple things. I mean, I've always been very interested in American composers. So that's dating way back to probably 1995 when I won something called the Artistic Ambassador Competition. And that was a program started in the 50s that sent American musicians. So it was a competition always for piano, and the other instrument rotated. That year it happened to be violin. And they basically sent us as artistic ambassadors to various countries to promote American music. So I won with a pianist called Daniel Weiser, who I still perform with all the time. We were both at Peabody. And we actually were assigned to go throughout the Middle East. So I remember our first stop was Bahrain, which at the time I had to look up on the map because I wasn't sure that was. Went to Qatar, Syria. We were in Tunisia and Egypt, in the West Bank. And then that was supposed to be the tour, and then they always picked about 3 or 4 winners. And one of the other winning duos actually had an arm injury, so they combined both of ours and ended up sending us also to Pakistan and Bangladesh, and Thailand, and all these places. So for that tour, we didn't do a ton of living American composers. The writing was very different then. I mean, that was really the time like Virgil Thompson and De La Joya. It was a lot different, I think, than it is now. So we were playing more like things by William Grant Still, of course, Copeland, Amy Beach, not living, but trying to get a representation. But what particularly drew my attention, that was my first introduction to Arab music, which was just fascinating. I really didn't know anything about it. So, whether we went to restaurants or just to actual concerts, and we even did a lot of exchanges with some Arab musicians. So that was a real awakening of that. I ended up going on 2 more tours. So I did one also in 1998, and then I did one just to Egypt in 2001, which was a combination of performing with Egyptian musicians. So I actually did some string quartets with 3 other Egyptian musicians, and then I did a few American things, and I actually had a few pieces commissioned for that as well. But that really opened up my thoughts of just Arab music. And I think what really drew me to your piece was just that it felt more like a more authentic feel towards the Arab sound that I knew as someone who's not Arab, but it really fascinated me. Also makes it a little tricky to learn, just like someone that didn't grow up with quarter tones. And, I remember I did go to this one, there's an Arab music camp up in Massachusetts.
Yeah, Mount Holyoke?
Yes, yeah. So I years ago went to that. And again, very interesting. It was a real interesting combination of real Arab musicians and then a few people like me that were just curious, and then a lot of musicologists. So, but I remember we'd have sightseeing class like every morning, and sometimes whatever the equivalent of the tonic was some quarter tone, and you just hear these 100 people trying to sort of meld into this quarter tone. But what really struck me with that, I think, too, was just the faculty were amazing. I mean, just the preciseness of intonation on these quarter tones was just astounding. And so that to me is something I've been trying to work on. You know what I mean? Just like how do I
It's a constant.
Exactly. How do I ingrain that the way I've ingrained just my major and minor scales?
Yeah.
That I've been doing
and
all
for
life.
people listening, the Mount Holyoke program, I think they're still doing it, and it's usually in the summer.
Yeah.
Right? So you can sign up for that. Like anybody can sign up for it, and they can just participate in the summer. It's a few weeks long, I think. You live together.
Yes.
And it's like just Arabic music all the time. I haven't myself gone to it, but I know about it. I know some of the professors that teach there. But this thing about learning these scales as if they're major and minor scales, the way that I approach it, at least in my music, is that I try to figure out a way to convince you in the music itself. So I think that's probably why you were attracted to the piece, because I'm not really forcing it in. I'm like saying, no, this is a sound that belongs in this context.
Yeah.
So that's what I try to do with every piece actually.
Yeah.
Is not make it sound like a foreign object. But the thing is, when a player approaches it like a foreign object, it will sound like a foreign object.
Yeah.
So I've had good performances, I've had bad performances, or I've had middle of the road performances, and it depends on the player or the players and how they approach these tones. Do they approach them as if they belong in the piece, or are they literally saying, "Oh, that's just like, that's the out of tune E flat. I don't have to worry about getting that one in tune because no one's gonna tell."
Yeah.
Well, they can tell if you're approaching that pitch in earnest instead of just randomly, just wherever it lands, it lands. And I've had both things happen.
Yeah, no, that's really true. And I think I even had a few lessons with one of the violin teachers there. I forget his name. He lives in the Lehigh Valley, but I think he also teaches in New York and at Berkeley. And he was an amazing both Arab and classical violinist. But like, you're absolutely right. The preciseness of these pitches was just incredible. But that is like, even looking at the solo violin piece that I bought of yours, like that was, I'm putting my tuner on like quarter tones to try to get into that, then I lose where the actual 440E is, know. And so that's something I've definitely been working on, just to get my ear in that world.
Well, I mean, I have to say, because I didn't say this before, but like you're the head of strings at Rowan University. I mean, you're like you are a big professor, but also have a lot of students, and you're still interested in experimenting.
Yeah,
which can't be said about every at least the professors I've come across with, especially players. Once they are established at a certain point, the sense of experimentation, the sense of trying to expand your skills, it kind of just stops. I don't know if that's something that you've seen around you as well, but
I have some real thoughts.
That's what draws me to you in this album, which we're going to talk about as well.
And to me, like, I have very strong feelings about the role of academia in the arts. So to me, like, particularly if you're a tenured professor, so like if you have gotten your tenure, and you're absolutely right, then you sort of have this choice of, do we use this security, and also like the options for grants and recordings, and you have a lot at your disposal, and do you actually use that to explore and promote different parts of the arts that may or may not get a big audience at first? So that's one of the huge advantages of academia that, say, just a concert series. Like, a concert series can't function without an audience. We obviously want an audience. I mean, like, it's not that, but we can function supposedly without it. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important, but I do think it gives an opening in academia to really explore things that we feel are really artistically very worthwhile. That may not draw the crowd of just a Beethoven sonata, that everybody knows how that goes. You're not questioning Beethoven's artistic value, you're just looking at the performer. And so that's something that I've been, again, sort of with this whole idea of American music in particular, because I do remember playing in contemporary ensembles in the 90s where a lot of series just looked at that as a bad word, like, oh, contemporary music, oh my gosh, you're throwing a dish against the wall or something like that, and maybe there was some warrant to that, maybe there wasn't, but I feel like lately, American music in particular has just really taken off. I mean, like, some of your writings, some of the writings in the CD, it's new, it's different, it's vibrant. To me, what's really fascinating is that it really shows the diversity that this country has through music, which I find that extremely interesting and very much worth, like, putting the investment of time and money and whatever needs to happen to have a really high quality product of that. Because to me, the writing is there, it's now just for the performers to get on board and really do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to actually show a couple minutes of your playing first.
Sure.
So we talked a little bit now, and I actually want to kind of start with the Arabic rendition here on the violin that you did of Lama badaa yatasana when he was bending. this is what we were talking about before in terms of your introduction to Arabic music, and also the fact that it's notated. You can hear some of the microtones, and also the ornamentations and things like that. So we can see that this is kind of a gateway actually to playing new American music in a strange way, because a lot of the techniques you're doing in here are not techniques you find in a Beethoven sonata, right?
It definitely. And then that's a particularly interesting piece. So that came across from a grant I got actually from Lehigh University, which was my very first teaching job. So I was on the faculty there right when 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, they decided, they actually got a big Mellon grant to form Institute of Arab Studies, essentially. And it wasn't like an actual degree, it was more just they were trying to make Arab studies in a lot of different areas just more present at Lehigh. So I was asked to represent the arts. As I'm sure you know, most arts budgets are very small, and so this was, for an artist, it was like, oh my gosh, like one of my first jobs, they said, can you have a list of books that the library should buy? And I said, sure. I said, so what's my budget? They said, well, try to keep it under 50,000. And I was like, 50,000 for books? Oh my gosh, okay. So to me, that felt like an enormous amount of money. So like I said, I am not Arab. I think they just asked me this because I had done these tours, and so I very quickly emailed every Arab composer or musician that I knew and said, what should be on this list? And they were very great about giving me a bunch of lists. And so that then evolved to, they eventually gave me a grant to do a concert and even to commission some works that had Arab and Israeli composers, but also they wanted a piece that was kind of a bridge. And this to me is also like a really interesting debate of just when you have a piece that sort of represents a culture or something like that, but is not so traditionally in that culture. So if you go like way back, Scheherazade, well, okay, just because it has, augmented second doesn't mean it's really Arab,
My music sometimes or often gets programmed with that piece, and I'm always like, really?
Oh,
Do you understand the historical context of what you're doing here? Yeah. But as a composer, you also have to realize, I'm very grateful that this orchestra, wants to play the music too. So you can't also say, oh, I don't like the program you're doing either. So you kind of have to play that game a little bit, unfortunately.
Yes, no, very much. And I've always felt a little guilty about that solo violin piece, because again, it was not written by an Arab, it was actually just written by one of the composition faculty at Lehigh. I do think it's a great piece.
It's great.
It's really a great
matter
piece.
Who wrote it?
Yeah.
I mean, the way he absorbed the main theme,
right,
and the way he made and the fact that he's doing variations on it is a very Western thing.
Yeah.
So he's not pretending like he's transcribing the piece. So that's what I appreciate about it. He's like taking it and making it his own.
Exactly.
To me, it doesn't matter if you're Arab or not Arab, or if you have an honest reflection of what you took in. And if that is what came out of it, I mean, I'm all for that. Yeah. Personally, that's just me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that to me, like, part of the CD was to try to have it. To me, it brings up a really interesting question of like, what is valid? And to me, if it's good, it's valid. Even like I remember taking that piece to the Arab music camp in Massachusetts and playing it for some of the people. And, all the non-Arabs said, oh, that definitely sounds Arab. But all the Arabs were like, it's kind of, you know what I mean? So, but they actually helped me. Like, there was, not on the CD just because it wasn't written in, but I remember one of the violin teachers at the very beginning saying, this would be a great place to just improvise. And I was like, great. And then, being very traditionally brought up, I'm like, can you write it out? And they're like, well, that's not really improvisation, So he did like play something that I recorded, and then a lot of times when I perform it, there actually is almost an extra minute to 2 minutes at the beginning that's just improvisation.
Right.
I did not put that in the CD just because the composer didn't write it, so he didn't even write the option for it. So I felt, out of respect to the composer, I probably shouldn't do that. But a lot of times when I do just perform it, I do add that in.
Yeah, you put like a taksim or something
Exactly.
at the very beginning. Of course, I mean, that would be a standard practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then how did you emerge out of that? So we were talking a little bit about American music. How did you emerge out of that and say, I don't want to just do this? I mean, because that by itself is a whole lifetime.
Yeah.
Besides,
Yeah.
of course, the Western training you have.
Right.
But then how did you say, I want to play XYZ composers that are all, by the way, featured on this album here, The Living American, which just came out like a few months ago, right? So
This was made possible actually by a grant from Rowan University. So the grant proposal, they awarded me a $25,000 grant, which was very generous for the CD. And the grant proposal was to look at living American composers and how they represented different aspects of American life. A lot of these people in here I know, like Avner Dorman is a close acquaintance. Jennifer Higdon is someone I've known for a very, very long time. I think someone like Jennifer Higdon, I almost equate her like with Copeland. It's sort of that she's almost become like a mainstay of Americana. But I wanted to make sure that we were representing more than just that. What I was trying to do with this CD was to have a lot of variety musically and ethnically, and sometimes those combined. And so what I find interesting with this is, okay, so like Jessie Montgomery is an African-American composer, but there's nothing particularly African about her writing in that piece. You know what I mean? There's other
that
things.
particular piece.
That particular piece, yeah. Whereas the piece, by Steven Sametz, he's not Arab, but there is an Arab, obviously, undertones to that. And then there's other pieces on there that are jazz influenced, some that are more funk, influenced. And so I was trying to really combine all that just to have in a very small CD, how does this reflect America through the arts? Because to me, that's something that to me is very important as a musician, that's our way of expressing these things. And that's our way of bringing these things sort of to the forefront.
Absolutely. And even with the Jessie Montgomery piece, she calls it Rhapsody.
Yeah.
I think Rhapsody number 2 even.
Yeah.
There's a Rhapsody number 1.
There is
right?
a Rhapsody number 1,
So
yeah.
there's a set. That's a
Yeah.
very Western kind of thing to do. So let's hear a couple minutes of you playing that piece. With this piece here, there's nothing, at least to my ears, again, I'm not African American or African in any sense, but there is a spirit to it. I guess you can say that. But the notes and rhythms themselves, they all seem to be coming from a rhapsodic tradition of playing the violin, right?
Yes, and she even says in her program notes she was really influenced by Bartok for that piece. So whereas other pieces, like I've done her Quartet Strum, which is one of her really famous ones. Like, it's hard to quite know how to pinpoint that one, but that's a very different feel.
Right.
Very different sort of feel to it.
So when so you said you got like a $25,000 grant, right, to do this series of pieces. So how does that work exactly? Because you're in academia, right? You're teaching, you're doing all this stuff, and then you want to do this, right?
Yeah.
So how does that all play out, and where does that money go?
A lot of it went to the recording engineer. That's
I feel like this is a mysterious part for people listening. You know, like how do things like this get done? You know,
Yeah.
Even if you have and how much does it cost? You said 25,000. Was that all you needed, or did you need more, or like how did that all break down?
Right. No,
for
it's
this
a
to
really good
happen?
question. So that's certainly for a CD that this one has a total of 4 musicians, but it's primarily just violin and piano, and then one piece adds a bass and drum set, a jazz piece. I guess looking at how I got the grant. So I am full-time professor at Rowan University in New Jersey, and so any tenure track professor has to do some sort of research. And so a research for a performer usually is performing, or it might be commissioning works, it might be recording works. So essentially making a CD is similar to publishing a book in other fields, or at least several papers, things like that. So from an academic standpoint, that was sort of the justification of the grant. So the grant was not just for musicians, but it was just for Rowan faculty. It included artists, but there were people asking for grants for new medical research or electronic research or anything. I was just very generous. I got a very generous grant for that. I think for anybody like looking for grants, I've always said the ones that are just music grants are by far the hardest to get. If you can find one that has a wider sense and they allow musicians, those are always the ones that I've gotten. And they're usually way more than a music grant. So I mean, I've applied for a music grant for $500 and been turned down, but then I get $25,000 from one that I probably was the only musician that bothered applying. Just a little practical thing. Some people are great at writing grants, propose stuff like that. These always seem to work. And the same thing at Lehigh. That grant I got for that was I think the only musician that applied.
Yeah, it's limited to the amount of people that can actually apply, right? Because it has to be people from that university in particular.
Exactly.
Whereas you have an international or national grant, you're dealing with like hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants.
Right.
And at that point, there are hundreds of people that deserve the money or will make use of it. So I personally used to apply to grants a lot, but now that I feel like I've kind of, at least I'm talking about the music-centric grants. I feel like at a certain point, you're spending way too much time just looking for opportunities and not actually doing the thing itself. And that's what I tell people all the time, is that stop worrying so much about winning a contest. Just write the music, because you're not going to get better at composing or playing an instrument if you're not doing it.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's what I think people miss that for whatever reason. It seems obvious when you say it out loud, but...
Yeah, no, it's very true. And I mean, I've come to that conclusion about particularly some of the smaller grants. It's like, all right, if it's a $500 grant, I could spend 10 hours trying to write this grant, or I could just teach 5 hours of private students and just donate that money to it.
Right.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, but in terms of where the money went, because I think, again, it is good to kind of know this. So I'm sure it's no shock to anybody that's made a CD. Unless you're awfully famous, you're not going to get a contract to get paid to make a CD. So, I mean, I've made a lot, but I've never really made any money off of them. So the way this particular thing broke down, so that was definitely a very generous grant. And I knew I could make a really great CD for that amount of money. I had made recordings for Albany Records before and just incredibly responsible. Susan Bush, who heads Albany, seems to answer emails before you even hit send. So, I mean, that's always really, really great. So I wanted to go with them again. They usually charge $5,000 plus a finished product. And then for that, they do all the design, they do all the artwork, they reproduce the CDs, they put it out into the world. It's great, so I don't have to do any of that. So that was $5,000. Obviously, the recording engineer is really important. So probably with technology today, a lot of people could do this for a lot less money. But I've used Andreas Meyer's Swan Studios, I believe is his company now. He's won several Grammy Awards, and he's made a lot of my CDs in the past. And I know the importance of that, because when you're recording, especially when it's in a real time limit, you really need someone back there that says, okay, we're great, except we need these 3 bars, or that wasn't quite in tune, like in this one part, can you do that again? And I really do trust him with that. He charges an hourly rate. It actually ended up being a little less than I thought, but I try to budget $10,000 to $15,000 for that, for a CD of this length. I think it did come in more around 10.
But does that include the venue itself?
No. So I was actually very generous. I had a very generous offer from University of Delaware. So University of Delaware is where we recorded it. It was actually one of my first teaching jobs, and I was in a quartet in residence there for a long time. So I have a relationship with them. But they actually built their recital hall for recording. So it's soundproofed, has a great piano.
Oh, wow, okay.
And Andreas teaches there. So he teaches a recording engineering class. So he is on faculty there. So they let me use that for free, which was very, very, very generous. I did a lot of it in August when things were quiet. That would normally be another part of the expense unless you have a venue. Like Rowan University, I actually recorded one of Renee's pieces just for myself there. And it was great, but I heard the floor creaking every time I rocked, and it's not as soundproof. So just things that really bother a recording engineer, like the air conditioning going on or off or stuff like that really do make a difference to a lot of people. But musicians, I think, are sometimes so used to it we forget that. So that was clearly not really an option. So this worked out great. And then of course I paid the musicians. Charles Abramovic is just a phenomenal pianist. He has the piano department at Temple. He was one of Midori's pianists for many years. He was actually my coach when I was at Temple getting my doctorate. So we've performed together a lot. And I know he's particularly good at contemporary music. Like that's one of his real strengths, and he's a real advocate of that. So I definitely wanted to use him. And then for the other pieces, the other piece that involved the drum and the bass, that was just, again, an added expense. So the musicians total, I did not pay myself anything, but probably musicians total was around $5,000 to $6,000. And then I was very fortunate to have a little bit left over to hire a PR person, and that really helped. So that was an extra $1,500, and she was great. So she got, I normally get maybe 2 or 3 reviews. This got, I think, at least 10.
So that wasn't included. The PR fee wasn't included in that Albany initial fee at all. So the PR is separate. Okay, that's something I didn't know.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, I thought PR would be part of that
So
package.
they put her down on Spotify and all that stuff. They do all that. But basically her job was to get it reviewed, to get interviews. So I had a lot of radio interviews. She sent it to every radio station, and a lot of them played different ones. And again, that often a lot of that happens a bit, but it's never happened to that level. And then I had about $2,500 left over. And I had mentioned this as a possibility in the grant. And that was, I made a video of one of the jazz tracks. So it was almost like a little, like a pop video sort of thing. And that was just really fun. That was just great fun. It was a very light track, and it was me just coming into this bar and basically playing, and the soundtrack was there, and that was just a fun aspect of it. So
because if you have extra money like this, if you don't use it, you lose it.
You lose it, yes, yeah. And I think one of the challenging things of this, just time-wise, so I had 1 year to spend this money. It just so happened that I was going on sabbatical and teaching in London for 6 of those 12 months. From the time I found out I got the grant, I realized I really only had about 3 to 4 months to finish this, because the rest of the time I was going to be in London, and that was just clearly too difficult to do all this. Fortunately, I had a lot of music prepared, but it did make me hesitant to learn a brand new piece that I had never done that was very difficult. For me to really absorb a piece where I want to put it on a CD that's going to be reviewed, ideally I like to have performed it at least 5 or 6 times, and and some of these pieces, like the Steven Sametz piece, I've been playing for over a decade, so that's obviously very ingrained. But that also did shape a little bit like the pieces I chose. If I had really had the full year, I probably would have included a few more things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely want to play a couple minutes of that feature the pianist Charles Abramovic. So let's hear. I think it's going to be Avner Dorman's Sonata for violin and piano. So let's hear a bit of that. I mean, it sounds like it's a big undertaking, but the fact that you're using, so what the theme of what you've been saying is that you used your connections that were pre-existing. It's not like you went out and said, oh, I want to be on gramophone,
Right.
which is what some people think that should happen, or I want to be on Sony Classical or whatever. You said, no, I have my venue at University of Delaware that I already know. I have my pianist that I already knew from Temple. And then you have the grant from Rowan. So you brought these three things together. And then the best part about it, in my view, is that there are no stipulation about what you did. There was nobody telling you, oh, no, you can't pick that. That Reena Esmail piece? No, we don't like her. We don't want that for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that's something also you avoid by going with the major label, right? That's going to be something else that is a pro.
Yeah.
Because you go with a major label like Gramophone or whoever, they're going to tell you, oh, we don't want that. We don't want this XYZ piece on for whatever reason.
Yeah, they are
Right.
a lot more picky. Yeah, they really are. So yeah, it was nice. And I think in addition to that, most of the composers I had a pretty strong relationship with. The only ones I've not met in person are Renee and Jessie. I've never met in person, but lots of email exchanges.
It's funny. Reena's music is programmed often with my stuff.
Yeah.
Like tomorrow's concert at Chamber Music Society has one of her pieces on along with mine. And like I would say like a good 20 to 25% of the time, anytime one of my pieces is played, one of her pieces is played on the same show.
Yeah.
If it's like a chamber music show,
Oh,
I mean.
interesting, yeah.
I guess that's just kind of what it is. This is one of those things you don't have control. It's like, okay, of course they're going to put the Indian, inspired person and the Arab inspired person on the same concert. Like that's that's kind of the creativity that we see here,
Right.
in terms of that. But I like that in general because I like Reena's music. If it was someone I didn't like, I'd be like, oh my god, why do I have to keep hearing this?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but there is a little bit of a danger, I think, especially people doing non-Western music, kind of getting lumped together a little bit.
Yeah.
But I like your CD because you don't necessarily do that. You have the Higdon on it. You have some of those jazz-inspired things on it, so you really help create a real melting pot.
Yeah.
Rather than kind of like sort of a ghetto where it's like just non-Western inspired music and then like everything else.
Right.
Like I had a flute player on, Brandon Patrick George, a couple months ago, that he came out with an album, and his album was great too because it was kind of similar to this idea, but he had non-Western inspired voices like mine and Reena.
Yeah.
And then he paired it with C.P. Bach, he paired it with Ruth Crawford Seeger, people like that. So I like not being in that non-Western ghetto, for lack of a better term. There's probably a better way to say it, but I like saying this stuff is just as valid as this stuff over here. It all belongs in the same pot.
Exactly.
Rather than, we're only going, all that stuff just belongs here and all that stuff just belongs here. Then the people that go to those shows, they don't mix.
Right.
So this is a problem that I'm seeing personally, especially at concerts, but I digress.
I have to say, I did pass all this by Jennifer Higdon and just asked her for advice, and she was really helpful. I've known her a long time.
With the curation of the CD?
Yeah.
Oh,
and like
really
what
curious.
composers to use and stuff like that.
I'm
And
super curious
she
about that.
definitely like made some recommendations, and and so some of them were from her as well. And I think what's also fascinating was the order that we put them in. So I think because not that many people actually buy a CD anymore, so so that's probably more important to the reviewers, than anything else. But at first, I was just going to put the 3 solo pieces at the beginning, and actually, Andreas, the engineer, said, "I don't think that quite works. Try this order," which is what it ended up being. And I thought, oh, that actually does flow as a CD. So
yeah, I mean, as a listener myself, it's like, for example, when I was listening to this CD. In preparation for today, it was just random.
Of course. And most people do, I
actually didn't go in order. I just said, I want to hear that first. Like, I think I heard the Arabic piece first because that just caught my attention.
Right.
And then I think I went to Avner's piece next. Then I went to Reena's piece. Then I went to, and it was random. I didn't. So sorry, I didn't follow the order.
No, most people don't. But I do find the reviewers they actually comment on that. Yeah. It's always fascinating what reviewers comment on. I mean, you think they're just going to comment on the playing, but but on a CD like this, it's probably 75% the composers, which makes sense. Yeah, because they're new pieces. I mean, a lot of these had never been recorded. Only 1 or 2 have been recorded. So it's about 75% the composers, like 20% the musicians, And then they often talk about the recording quality, and if it's good, they're less likely to mention that, but they do often mention how close the mic is or not, how much reverb you have or not. I think as a performer, like I tend to just kind of focus on my playing, obviously, and so it's just, you're reminded it's a whole package, it's a package deal.
And the reviews you're getting, it's interesting because I just got a set of reviews from the orchestra show, and that's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
Reviews of a concert performance.
Sure.
And a review, especially concert performance that happened many times. So there's reviews of different nights versus a studio recording where everything is literally exposed. Like if there's something negative that's said, for example, it's like, I think it hurts even more because you had 100% control over that.
Exactly, yes.
Whereas in a concert setting, you might not because you don't know who's there, the audience.
Right.
They feed off, you feed off the audience. The reviewer hears the clapping or not, or no clapping.
Yeah.
I realized this actually after I got my reviews back. So I'm wondering, did you have a sense of, I care, I don't care so much about what the reviews say?
I mean, of course you care, but I think it is fascinating to get so many reviews from exactly the same CD. So like if you're giving, say, multiple concerts of the same piece, some days you may just feel you had a good day or you didn't or whatever. But in this case, this is like exactly the same one. And ironically, the most controversial was the jazz piece, which was the lightest. And some reviewers love that, and others were like, why is this on this CD? Like, why can't we have more serious music like Avner Dorman, and Jennifer Hayden? So that I found interesting. I mean, I was very grateful that everything about the playing was very positive. So that was, kind of, because I've certainly had reviews where that's not been the case. So that was a relief. And you never honestly know. I mean, there have been some times I've just thought, this is okay, I'm putting out a great recording of this, and it gets okay reviews. And I think I've made 6 or 7 CDs throughout my career. So like, you just never quite know how they're going to come across, particularly when it's music that people don't know and a wide range of styles, as you said. So, you might get a reviewer that sees all of that. You might get one that really wants, more of a hardcore, what they consider a hardcore classical contemporary thing. Yeah. I think it was also interesting seeing some of the non-American reviews, like particularly ones from the UK or Canada, and just...
So you're getting reviews from overseas
yeah,
too? Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Like Gramophone reviewed it, and Textura reviewed it, and it was interesting. Like there was one review that basically said, all the playing is great and the pieces are great, but it's too optimistic for where America is right now, and like just society. I was like, okay.
So they put their own bias.
They really did. This was clearly not an American. Like they
right.
said, your country's a mess. You shouldn't be that optimistic, about like this is too much, and I thought,
it's kind of weird.
Okay.
But the fact that people are writing it this way, though, that's not you writing the music either.
Exactly.
And you got like 6, 7, 8 voices on this thing.
Yeah.
So, what did he want you to put in there?
Yeah, it's
I wonder,
hard.
what is it? What did he
hard
want?
to know.
Did he want Charles Warren or something?
Yeah,
not to call,
exactly.
What did he want on the CD?
Yeah.
As an American representation, I wonder.
Yeah. I found that review particularly curious. But I mean, like I'm very happy with it. Like to me, it was a concept I had. I thought it was well thought through. But I do think if there's anything to learn from reviews, it's just, you really do have to look at the total picture. What does the program make sense? Does it hold together? Do we need it? Like to me, we really need this. Do we need me performing the 10 Beethoven sonatas again? Probably not. I mean, like performing them, okay, but recording them, I mean, come on. Like, there's just so many amazing recordings. But for me, like particularly at my age and at my point in the career, like this really feels like I'm doing something. I'm really bringing to a recording a lot of pieces that had never been recorded. Like when I was talking to Avner Dorman, for whatever reason, that sonata had never been recorded.
Really?
Yeah, that's the first recording.
Piece.
I know. It's his first one.
Old for a classic.
Yeah.
2004, I think, right?
Yeah. So
that's very weird.
He was thrilled that got recorded because, Gil Shaham did his third one, which he said is by far the most famous. And so, he was very happy that, that was going to be recorded.
Yeah, of course.
To me, that's like really special to be the first one to do that. on an actual like CD, not just a performance.
Yeah. And the other thing you're doing too that I hope doesn't get lost on people listening too is like you are, whether you know it or not, you're a role model for people that you're teaching, right?
Yeah.
And it's saying that this is a valid thing to do.
Absolutely.
Because at least, not to call out one of the schools I went to, but like at Juilliard, for example, there was not a focus really at all on students learning any of this kind of repertoire at all.
Yes.
And I could say that from experience because it was very difficult to get people to play on the composition concerts. And I in a way, I don't blame them because their teachers didn't encourage them to go that route. So seeing someone like you, who is a terrific, I mean, you can stand your own with any of these people that teach at Juilliard and easily. And that's a whole different discussion too. This whole idea of, you have to go to a Juilliard or to a Peabody or whatever school to make it. I think it shows another side of how to do this thing. You don't have to do it that way to have a fulfilling career in music.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I studied with Dorothy DeLay, who was like the big queen of violin back in, for a very long time. And I remember taking my Juilliard audition and you had to do a contemporary piece. And she just flat out said, they won't hear it. So like pick something easy or just learn like 3 lines just in case. But like they're interested in your concerto and your Bach. I'm like, that's it. So you do, I mean, it's sad to hear that's still kind of the case, but it's like.
And they try to, I don't know if it's still like this because I graduated in 2016. So, but at that time, which is still not a lot, they were offering musicians $75 a concert to play on the composition series. Wow. And guess how many people took that offer? So $75, but I'm going to rehearse like 20 hours for this piece.
Yeah.
And then the concert on top of that. No thanks.
Yeah.
It was very difficult unless you were like actual friends with these people. And then even then they said, okay, I'll do this favor for you. It wasn't even like something they were excited about doing. And I don't want to generalize, but in general, that's how there's 800 students there. I would say there were maybe at any one time 20 to 30 people that were actually really interested to do any of this stuff.
And it's a shame because that's why music gets stuck. It really does. And so that is why, like, not only do I do this, but like at Rowan, I run a string ensemble, which is roughly 10 to 12 of the best string students. There's no conductor. I play concertmaster. And we always do new music. We do some traditional too. Like we just did a premiere of a piece that Joe Goodrich wrote, who's also on the CD. And like we're doing next Tuesday a piece by a British composer who's around my age, so in his 50s.
Which composer is it?
Neil Luckett. So during my sabbatical, I was teaching at the London College of Music, and he's a doctorate student there. And he had actually done some arranging for Sting, so like that's more his world. And he just brought me this MIDI file of a string quartet that had never been played other than the computer. And he said, can you just give me some comments on this? And I said, it's a cool piece. It was like 5 movements on this different blues riff, but it was very edgy, very almost metallic. And so I said, hey, if you want to arrange this for string orchestra, I'll play it, which he did. I think one of the challenges for us, and we went into this, and keep in mind, this is a situation we actually have 12 weeks to rehearse this along with a bunch of other stuff, but you can really grow with it. It's not like, oh my gosh, we have to put this together in 2 hours and see what we can do, so we could really grow with it. One of the things that I told the students is don't look at this the way you look at a Beethoven symphony where you're dissecting every line and dot and dash or what did he mean? This is part of the growth process. So like there's one movement where on the MIDI file, there was a lot of very clearly accented notes and articulations that didn't quite make it into the printed thing. And those are things I emailed back to the composer saying like, we need this, like we really need, musicians today need this kind of detail. If you don't, then at least put something, like accent freely or something like that, So it's been really a fascinating process of owning the piece. And one of the reasons I feel it is so important for musicians to play living composers is that you do get that sense of ownership. There are a lot of pieces that I've worked on a lot with composers, particularly if they're just solo violin, because then you really have so few constraints where I'm like, this is great. Have you ever considered doing this passage in harmonics? Or, you could add a run of thirds here and it wouldn't disrupt it too much. And they either like it or they don't. If they don't like it, I don't do it. You know what I mean? But it just becomes a dialogue of what you can do. And to me, that's so important for both parties. And I always say one of the bravest things I've ever done was there's a Beethoven 6 violin sonata for violin and piano, which is probably the least done out of all 10. And it's a variation movement, and there's this one variation where there's these very quick chords in the violin, and they just always sound terrible. And I mean, even Anne-Sophie Mutter, who's executing them perfectly, it still is like, oh, that doesn't sound good. And I was doing this once, and the pianist said, "You ever tried that pizzicato?" And I'm like, oh, that really would sound a lot better. And so I did a pizzicato, and I was like, oh, that really does work. And I just was convinced the heavens were going to open and Beethoven was going to throw a lightning bolt down to like execute me right on the spot. But like, that's a case where it's like, all right, Beethoven is an amazing composer, but I think he was wrong on those 4 bars.
It could happen.
Yeah, they
Absolutely.
really are better pits. You know, it's like, and I always say that was probably the bravest thing I ever did was I got on stage and I did them pizzicato, even though.
But with people in the audience knowing that you were doing something.
I mean, a violinist would.
Yeah,
you know.
that's what I mean. That's the other thing. Would somebody actually notice unless they knew the music?
A violinist would know, but I think most other people would just think it sounded better, you know?
Yeah, that's
so,
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, at least I'm not comparing myself to any of those people, but like me and other people that I think they're doing stuff in the field, they're very open-minded when it comes to, especially when a player like you tells them this, let me at least show you what this sounds like. And sometimes with the composite, like for example, when I had this piece done, I've been saying it on this show a lot lately, but there was always something from this experience that I learned a lot from with the LA Phil, where I just actually I went even further than that. I said, I don't know exactly how to notate this at all, but I wanted to sound like this. Mm-hmm. And it was the particular thing was I wanted the bass drum to sound like a heartbeat. How do you do that? Because the bass drum, you go boom,
right,
and it has a kind of windy sound.
Yeah.
And I don't want that. I just want boom,
yeah,
boom, boom, boom. So sometimes things like that are enough for the player, and it was, and they had to do all this stuff to the bass drum. Actually, it was actually quite complicated to make the bass drum sound that way, but they did it. I didn't have to make a diagram, or I didn't have to I didn't have to send like a toolkit or anything like.
Right.
They just did it, and I think sometimes composers, we are a little bit too precious with the material. And forget that there's an overall effect that we're trying to do, not just like, okay, that bar really has to look like that, or else I'm gonna, drop dead right there, or call the tempo police, or call the, I don't know what you want to call it. So another thing I noticed too in your playing was the Reena Esmail's piece. I want to play a couple of minutes of that because the notation itself is very interesting in itself. There are these, you'll see in the score, you'll see it soon, if for people watching, is that there's these little note heads that look like grace notes, but they're not grace notes. So I want to talk a little bit about that before we wrap it up. Here you have somebody, like you were talking about the MIDI situation where
Yeah.
they're not really being specific with what they want. But here in the Esmail piece, it's extremely specific, especially in terms of the ornamentation, the duration of notes. What the heck is happening with these little notes? Because I was trying to even figure it out, and it's something I haven't really seen before.
Yeah, no, I love that piece. And that, I think, like, along with, I think I first heard about you, I somehow got some email with a link, that, and I was like, oh, that's really pretty cool. And I get these links at least twice a week, so
yeah?
something. But her piece was another one. It just said, thought you might be interested in this. And I was like, oh, I am interested in that. But as I really delved into her piece, I actually found that one the most challenging of anything on the
Really?
CD. Yeah,
It doesn't sound the most
It's
challenging when
not
you
so
play
much
it.
the notes,
Okay.
but it was just, how do I get the timbre right? How do I get the timing exactly right so that it doesn't feel rushed, but there is like a sense of pulse? And she actually, in her notes, recommended a specific classical Indian violinist that played like actual Indian improvisation. And I remember logging into this, and there was one thing, and it was an hour. And I thought, an hour? Oh my gosh. I've never been so captivated in an hour forever. And really, really, really amazing. And so I was really trying to figure out why that sounded so different. Is it the vibrato? Is it just the way she's pulling the bow? Is it like the length of stuff? And so to me, that was one of the biggest challenges. And the other thing with that piece is the engineer and I agreed there could only be one splice. There's like one spot kind of halfway through where it sort of cadences and then sort of starts a whole nother news section.
I think that's the excerpt that I played, actually.
Yeah. So we both agreed that there's just no way you could splice that because the pauses and the silences are so dependent on what comes before or after it. And I think another thing that really was the debate on that was how much reverb to add to it, because to me that's very much part of the piece. And so I had recorded this just sort of informally at Rowan about a year earlier, just to kind of see what it sounded like. And he added a tremendous amount of reverb, which I kind of liked. Andreas said, I think that's almost getting to the point of like caricature, and it's a little. So I think what he did was actually really appropriate. But that was another thing, because when I added all that reverb, I said, oh, I'm rushing these pauses too much now. Because with what I was hearing when I played it, it was fine. But when you're suddenly adding this enormous amount of reverb, it didn't really give time for that to settle. So, yeah, I mean, she does give some really great notes about who to watch, who to listen to. But I did find that one the most challenging, just trying to figure out how to get a sound that was more appropriate for that piece. But to me, it was extremely rewarding because I really felt like I was delving into a different musical language that was, yes, written for someone with my training to be able to play, but really pushing the boundaries of, I don't even say my comfort zone, but my, like, what I was familiar with, which I just love that. It's like, it just, to me, it really opened up a lot of thinking about just different colors and stuff like that.
I mean, the piece itself doesn't seem technically difficult
No,
in terms
it's
of
not.
fingering and this kind
Yeah,
of thing.
no,
it's
that's not. Yeah.
And and mostly in terms of fingering and just the bow movement,
Yeah.
things like that. But the interpretation is the most difficult part, because if you just played that thing straight,
Yeah.
as it's written like that, I mean, it wouldn't be anywhere near the effect that your recording had. I mean, it needed everything to kind of lock in.
Definitely.
For it to sound right.
Yeah. And the pacing, like particularly the first half, the pacing was not having it sound rushed, and like even just like, is this leading into this, or does this flurry of notes, is that actually more the destination? And if it is, like, how much do you spread that out or not? Ironically, on the CD too, I'm actually using two different violins. So I have two really good violins. One is the Testore, which is very narrow, very high-pitched, very, very clear. And the other one is a very oversized Vuillaume. So for violinists, it's a Maggini model, which Maggini was a violin maker before Stradivarius when they hadn't figured out the perfect size. So it's actually quite a bit bigger than an average violin. Like, I had to have a special case made for it. So that violin, it almost sounds like a viola. Like, it has a very deep tone. If I'm remembering correctly, I used the smaller one for the 3 solo violin pieces, and then the other one for everything else.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't. I mean, I guess you don't want. You also don't really want the listener to tell. I
Right.
would assume it's just only you really know what's going on.
Yeah.
But would a violinist they'd be able to tell?
I think they would definitely be able to
Okay.
tell if they were hearing it live. I think
Yeah.
because there is like the reverb is really different for each track. So, the jazz track obviously is very dry, and the more improvised stuff is a lot wetter. So that, of course, just changes it right there. But I think if I was playing them in a concert hall, you would definitely, like all my students definitely hear a difference.
No,
you know?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I would encourage anybody listening up to this point, to check out The Living American. It's on all platforms, I'm assuming,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And listen to these pieces in full because they're all really terrific. So I appreciate you being on.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.